This is, I think, take 3 on our Blogging Pins conversation about religion and politics, and that's okay. This is why we are journalists and do not work for Apple or another technology firm, but we are hopeful that we're going to make it through this time. We'll do a quick reintroduction.
If nothing else, this may improve my prayer life.
Maybe that's the problem. Yes, we are not multitasking here with some divine interference. So I am Amy Sullivan, and I'm a contributing writer with Time Magazine.
And I'm Melinda Henneberger, and I'm a contributing writer with Time Magazine.
And this was not set up by Time PR to be some sort of
I'm not sure they even realize that. So yes, we're going to be giving you very diverse perspectives today.
Yes. Which would be true even if we didn't write for the same magazine. But
that's correct.
Anyway, so there was a recent story that you had in Time 2 weeks ago that was a profile of John Huntsman that was really fascinating and worth reading for anybody just to get a sense of who he is. Because many of us only knew that he was this governor from Utah who Democrats for some reason thought it was a good idea to get out of the country for a few years. And you got into actually why that is and why he might be a formidable opponent in 2012. But you also got into the issue of religion with him because he is Mormon, or at least grew up Mormon. And I thought that would be a good place to start our conversation, is having you kind of walk us through.
Well, John Huntsman, this was definitely not a question out of the blue about his religion. In fact, before the interview, when his spokesman asked me the usual question about, well, is there anything in particular you're going to be focusing on? Mm-hmm. The one thing I mentioned was, I said, if you Google me, you'll find that I'm very interested in religion, so absolutely we'll be talking about that. But nonetheless, when I asked him the usual question that everybody wonders about, because Mitt Romney's Mormon faith was an issue when he ran for president in 2008, everyone wonders, has the country changed since then? Has some prejudice against those of the Mormon faith lessened since that time? There has been a lot of polling that would indicate that Americans are just about as ready to elect a Mormon president as they are to elect an atheist. That is to say, it's not on top of the list.
Right.
But, so when I asked him about that, he said, oh, absolutely, that's changed. But he said, I'm very proud. I'm more spiritual than I am religious. I have, he talked a lot about his ties to different religions. His daughters have gone to Catholic school. One of his daughters was married at the National Cathedral here in Washington. That he becomes very emotional when he goes into any church or synagogue. And he said, I'm very proud of my Mormon roots. And I thought, oh, roots, that makes it sound like he's no longer a part of the church.
That's an interesting way of describing it.
So when I asked him about that, he said, oh, yeah, that's tough to define. And so we went back and forth several times, and he never really did answer the question. And when I asked several of his aides about that later, they said, gosh, dunno, you'd really have to ask him. So even though after my story ran, his aides were very fast to clarify to other outlets that, yes, he's a Mormon in good standing, I really didn't know the answer to the question even after all the time, and I spent a couple hours with them over about a week's time. So I think that my takeaway from all that was whether or not voters really care about that, and I'm really not sure the answer to that, but I'm also not sure whether he's a lapsed Mormon, meaning that he's kind of a cultural Mormon, doesn't really believe anymore, or whether he looked at the problems Mitt Romney had in 2008 and thought, maybe it would behoove me to distance myself a little bit. Either way, I think that the campaign probably did the calculation that it would be better for them to fudge a little bit and to maybe take a few hits for being a little weaselly on that question than it would be to either say I'm lapsed or I'm a very devout believer. So,
Right.
Do you think that's an issue still with voters?
I do, and I think he's in a very tough position because it is difficult for a Mormon to run for the nomination in the Republican primary, and I'll get into a couple of the reasons from 2008 that we know that. But it's also difficult for a Republican candidate to run as only vaguely religious or lapsed of some sort. You can certainly win the nomination. I mean, John McCain is one of many examples from the Republican Party of people who are only nominally connected to a religious tradition who, end up once they have the nomination. Including Reagan, including George H.W. Bush, including, all sorts of people, with the exception of George W. Bush. He was really the rare candidate who was a favorite of social conservatives, both in the primaries and then in the general election. But I think if you're a Mormon, you almost have to disavow your faith entirely. It's not enough to say, well, I'm not a very good Mormon. And he may be reacting, as you said, to some of the feedback that Mitt Romney got, because he was always described in all of these different news articles and stories as a devout Mormon, which I think people meant by he's very serious about his faith, and it was a way of describing how upright and doubly do right he seems to be. And yet, for people who are concerned about Mormons, I think they read that as he's really, really Mormon. And if you're worried about it, you should be really worried with Mitt Romney. I remember, I think it was in the Ames straw poll in the summer of 2007, and he did really well, that he called up all of his family onto the platform with him after it was over, because they had all hit Iowa and they had been campaigning like crazy for him. And it was really sweet because he had everybody up there. But the image was this enormous Mormon family of people who look exactly like each other, which I don't think is really the visual that he wants, even though he does have just one wife, Anne, who he's been married to for a very long time. And he likes to say he was the only candidate in that race who did have just one marriage.
Who still had his first wife, right. Well, it does seem like a bit of a no-win situation, and it seems that he Huntsman would be hurt by sort of taking the Kennedy line from 1960. Remember when Jackie Kennedy said, to a friend, it's so unfair that they hold Jack's Catholic faith against him when he's such a poor Catholic. I don't think she said that publicly at the time, but...
And Huntsman may be thinking the same, but it just struck me when you were describing the way he talked about his faith, being spiritual but not religious and interested in all of these faiths, that's exactly what a Democratic candidate would be hit for as proof that they weren't religious at all. Remember Howard Dean talking about how he left a church over a dispute over the bike path. And that was seen by people as, that guy is definitely not religious. But even though you could say,
well, that sounds like a true story, doesn't it? That doesn't sound like something concocted
you wouldn't make
for
that
political
up.
Consumption.
Yeah, that's definitely not spin that's going to help you. It's true. But,
bike pathsism.
Looking at what the path to the nomination would be this time around, Mitt Romney has talked about, or there's some assumption that he may skip Iowa, or at least not try very hard there. But South Carolina comes up pretty soon in the schedule as well. And, last time around, that was the site of some really nasty, actually, rumors and emails that went around about Mitt Romney. And I have a couple of them here just to give folks a sense of kind of what the feeling is out there. And I also should say I've been following this issue since 2005 when people first started talking up Mitt Romney. And I wrote a piece for the Washington Monthly about why I didn't think Mitt Romney could win because he had an evangelical problem that was basically motivated by the fact that I grew up in a pretty conservative evangelical church. And 1 month when I was 8 or 9, we had a month-long seminar in Sunday school on cults. And so we learned about Jim Jones, and we learned about devil worshippers, and we learned about Mormons. And we saw film strips about Mormons floating in space and purporting to tell us about Mormon theology. And we were told they were cult members. And I am certainly not the only evangelical who grew up in a church hearing that. And for all the Mormons out there, I want to make clear that was not my personal belief. So I got a lot of interesting Mormon mail, very polite hate mail, after that article came out. But there are a lot of folks who are still hearing that in their church. In fact, there was a Texas pastor in 2007 who gave a sermon in Dallas where he said something along the lines of, Mitt Romney says that he believes in Jesus Christ as his Savior. He says he's a Christian, but let me make clear, he is not a Christian. Mormon, or the Mormon religion, is not part of Christianity. It is a cult. And that
Don't you think, though, that there's a case to be made that because Mitt Romney is not a new commodity and because I know that a lot of people of the Mormon faith are not delighted with, the years of Big Love on TV and the Book of Mormon on Broadway, but don't you think it has taken a little bit of the exoticism out of it, and that people are willing to become or to see Mormons in a less prejudiced light?
That's a really good question, it's funny that you bring up Big Love. Mitt Romney must think
which I never saw a single time. I know a lot of people enjoyed it.
I loved the series, most of it, but he must just think he has the worst look ever because that premiered in 2007, the first time he ran. And yes, now we have the smash Broadway hit, The Book of Mormon, that is up during his second run at the nomination. But it's a really good question because one of the things I found when I was researching this article was that anti-Mormon bias is one of the very few kinds of bias that doesn't get better with more information or more familiarity.
Really?
Yes. Most kinds of bias, if you get to know more about the people, you know more about their differences, it becomes less dangerous, less frightening. And your level of bias goes down. The problem for Mitt Romney is that the folks who vote in Republican primaries, it's not that they don't know anything about Mormonism. They know about Mormonism, and what they know makes them uncomfortable. Almost the more religious you are, and the more you hear about Mormon theology, the more likely you are to think this is absolutely not part of my religion.
I wonder how much if that will take a back seat this cycle, since this really is going to be an election, most people think that in which the economy will really be front and center, the economy and jobs. So will people who might have been a little wary of that decide that really if one of these guys is the person who can fix the economy, does it much matter whether their faith is one that makes them a little bit uncomfortable? And really, don't all of our faiths sound a little cultish to someone outside the faith? I remember I had an editor one time who was saying that about some some group of believers. I really can't even remember who it was. And I said, and he was a Catholic like I am, and I said, I mean, the body, the blood, I mean, that sounds weird, of course, to people outside our faith. So, I just wonder how with the economy so front and center, how much that will be a factor next time.
Right. Well, that's a good point, and we don't know how it will play out. But I can point to 2008, which was also obviously an election where the economy was a big issue.
Right. That's true.
The fall rolled around, and so that was a year where it was impossible to say that Catholics voted as Catholics, for instance.
Right.
Because if you looked at the way the vote broke down, Catholics voted the way most people voted. They voted based on the economy. And so based on that, they voted for Barack Obama. Evangelicals, of course,
there's an argument to be made that we always vote like that because we're such a diverse group.
Yes, well,
I know it's an enduring debate. Is there
vote.
Such a thing as the Catholic vote?
Right.
Sorry, go ahead.
And there isn't. But that's just a case of a group that does care about things like social issues, but in this case was willing to either set those aside or decide that the economy was the number one priority. Evangelicals did not react the same way. They voted for John McCain in about the same numbers that they voted for George W. Bush. So the
now, see, isn't that interesting that his faith, his lack of overt shows of devoutness didn't really affect those evangelical voters?
Well,
you would think
it did during the primaries. And that's why Mike Huckabee was able to give him such a run for his money on virtually, a zero funding campaign that Huckabee had, was because of the fact that John McCain is a guy who says that he's a Baptist, but he hasn't been baptized. Which, as a Baptist, I have to say, is kind of the prerequisite for being a Baptist.
Right.
So he was, definitely not Mr. Holy Roller. But in the general election, compared to a guy who many conservative evangelicals were being told was either a militant black liberation theology follower or a secularist, godless secularist, or a secret Muslim.
See, that's the thing that gets me about this whole, question about Obama's religion is it can't be both. You can't say that you dislike Obama's radical Christianity and also that he's a secret Muslim. So those two things don't work together, I don't see. But
they shouldn't, but people do, in fact, hold those beliefs, or at least can make those arguments without batting an eye sometimes.
How do you think that will affect Obama in 12? Will questions about his faith?
It's a good question because the White House has been a little schizophrenic in terms of how it's dealt with questions about his faith. Led, I think, by Obama himself, who understandably is often kind of as close as he gets publicly to being pissed off when he talks. If you heard his talk at the National Prayer Breakfast this year, it was the most candid religious testimony, basically. He gave his testimony of any American president, including George W. Bush. It was just all about his faith and his belief in Jesus Christ and just laying it out there. But the tone of his voice and the look on his face for much of it was kind of like, I cannot believe you people are making me prove my faith like this. Is this good enough for you? How much more do I need to do? Do I need to get down on my knees? What's going to be enough? And so, his heart is, again, understandably, because people are questioning his faith, not in making big shows to try to prove it. At the same time, he and his family have chosen, for various reasons, not to go to a church while they're in D.C. And that, I think, could help offset questions if people had a sense
it certainly
that, it was part of
could,
his
and
life.
yet, if he did go, people would say he was only going for political reasons.
Yeah.
And when he does go occasionally, it is, for some, played that way. But the first time I ever saw Obama in person, well, I guess except at the 08 convention, at the 04 convention, rather, in Boston, where he really gave that nominating speech and made such a splash, was in Brown Chapel in Selma, Alabama, on the observation of Bloody Sunday. I think it was.
Oh, right. He was there with Joseph Lowry. Yeah.
Yes. And he spoke like a preacher.
Yeah.
I mean, he really did the call and response. I mean, that was not his first time in a church. So to hear him and cite very easily and in a way that to me would have been impossible to fake. And on that day, there was sort of an unfortunate juxtaposition of just down the block, Hillary Clinton was speaking in another church and decided for whatever reason, using a very kind of southern accent that day. I don't know if you remember that.
Yes, it
But I was very surprised, since that was my personal introduction to Barack Obama, to hear then these questions about his Christianity. Which were fueled by all sides. Didn't Hillary Clinton at one point question, he's a Christian as far as I know, or something along those lines?
Yes, he says he's a Christian.
But I think some of the enduring question about his faith, even though I obviously have no such question, is about people's feeling about Obama that he's a guy who's tough to figure, that he's this very cool, cerebral character who, even after all this time, and even given all his gifts as a speaker, people just really don't feel, who is this guy? I think that there's still, and some of that may be prejudice based on race, but some of it, I think, really is this feeling that I'm still not positive about him because he's not a great emoter all the time. Maybe people want to see a little more sweat than this very sort of cool exterior. I don't know. What do you think?
So it goes more than faith. You're saying they just don't know who he is as a person.
I think there's some of that.
Yeah. It is definitely. He has almost like a television persona that works for him, and yet, voters need something a little more real when they're trying to get the measure of a candidate. And, it's such an imprecise way of evaluating people anyway. This is what I've been thinking through with religion for a long time, that religion, I would argue, kind of popped up as a proxy for a politician's moral sense, because it wasn't an issue at all until Watergate rolled around. And my argument has been that people looked at Watergate and realized that wasn't a matter of failing to know Richard Nixon's policy positions. It was a matter of failing to know who he was in terms of his moral universe. And so they realized, this is something we need to factor into our decision making about candidates, and who comes up in the next cycle. But Jimmy Carter, a guy who talked with such moral language and was very open about being a born again evangelical Christian. And so I don't know that necessarily had to be the answer of how we came up with a proxy for morality and values, but for better or worse, it is the way
I read Jimmy Carter's diaries that came out last year, I think it was, And I was amazed at, I mean, even knowing, yes, he's a very serious evangelical, knowing that, but seeing on every page of the diary, Rosalind and I prayed tonight, Rosalind and I went to services, Rosalind, and it was very, seemed to be very heartfelt and pervasive. I mean, it literally was throughout the thing in a way that it was surprising to me when you saw George W. Bush covered as sort of, you know, a guy who wore his religion on his sleeve in a way that was unprecedented. I guess we have a very short memory about that kind of thing.
Oh, we absolutely do. Because Carter taught Sunday school while he was in the White House. He apparently didn't have enough to do. Because
I think that it does. It has become a proxy faith for, can I trust this guy? And really we should know better, because some people, you know, it doesn't always work that way. But I think for a lot of voters, it's kind of a shorthand of, okay, I might not be following every jot and tittle of policy, but so I want to trust somebody to be on top of it, and I want it to be somebody whose values are consonant with mine. And that's what you hear over and over again, I think, from voters.
Yeah, well, and, you know, it should be a problem for the Obama campaign, and, you know, if I were them, I would be polling on this to figure out how much of a sense people have of who he is as a person. You know, there was a Pew poll that came out last summer that got a lot of attention for the percentage of people who thought Obama was a Muslim. I think it was 22%.
A third, was that right?
Not a third, but between
maybe it was a third of Republicans.
Yes. Well, Republicans definitely at a much higher percentage thought he was a Muslim. But the number that struck me was, I think, it was a third of respondents knew he was a Christian. And I thought that was extremely low. A majority did not know what his religious faith was. And that told me that they just didn't know who he was, not that they didn't know his faith. That was their way of expressing that they just didn't have a good sense of the guy. And that's, you know, he obviously won the first time around without having that. But as you've said, that's kind of a threshold that voters have of needing to feel like they can at least relate to somebody before they start looking at the issues that matter to them and where that person is on the issues. So that's the Democratic field, and we've looked a little bit at the Republican field, at least the two Mormons.
What do you think? Who will be the social conservative favorite if both Sarah Palin and Michelle Bachmann get in?
Oh, wow. That's a good question. You know, Palin was definitely successful at rallying evangelicals for the McCain campaign. It wasn't that evangelicals were going to vote for Obama in large numbers, although I think a quarter did. It was that by late August, when you polled Republicans, the least enthusiastic voters out there were the most conservative evangelicals. They just were not psyched about John McCain, and the question was, were they going to turn out at all? And those numbers completely turned around once Sarah Palin was on the ticket. So she definitely has some attraction and draw there. So does Michelle Bachmann. You know, she has a very long history of being active with her church and you know, saying some odd things about separation of church and state, but you know, she might fit in very well among the social conservatives who have become kind of the bloc that you have to get. There were more than 40% of the Republican primary vote in 2008 were evangelicals.
And she's from Iowa, so that would seem to be a help.
She was born in Iowa, although so far her...
in Waterloo.
She is from Waterloo. I didn't know that.
Yes. She
But
can maybe use that ABBA song as her campaign theme song.
That would be great. Yeah. We can look
Who was
forward
it?
to...
Oh, yeah, we heard the other day that Newt's ringtone is Dancing Queen.
ABBA. Yeah, that's exactly what I would have pegged for him. Well, Bachmann, yes, does have that connection. She just canceled last night on a Iowa Republican fundraiser, which did not endear her to folks there.
Is that the one, though, for technical difficulties? Which we can relate to?
We can, although she was supposed to be there in person, and then she appeared via Skype instead. And that apparently didn't go down too well with folks in Polk County. But yes, if the two of them get in the race, that alters things, because with Mike Huckabee declining to run this time around, there really isn't, at this point, one single candidate who looks like they'll attract most of the social conservatives. The one person who I thought probably benefited the most from Huckabee staying out of the race was Tim Pawlenty, who isn't a huge favorite of social conservatives, but he's not objectionable. He goes to Leith Anderson's church. He's the head of the National Association of Evangelicals. And the biggest thing is Pawlenty just has a pretty broad coalition, and all he has to do is draw some social conservatives into that, and that could be enough for him. He doesn't need to get them all.
Yes, he doesn't have any stands that bother social conservatives. I mean, but like back to Huntsman for a minute. I mean, he approves of and pushed through in Utah when he was governor there civil unions for same-sex couples. But again, back to the economic, the dominance of the economic issue. I just can't see that driving away an enormous number of even Republican primary voters, especially given the fact that younger evangelicals just don't see that as a very big issue, do they?
They don't, but younger evangelicals do not participate in the Republican primary in large numbers. Although I agree with you that the economy maybe should be the bigger issue, I could see something like somebody's position on civil unions being a disqualifying factor. I can just imagine that coming up over and over and over in all of the debates that they have. His opponents will smell weakness on that point. So it's all a question of how strong he seems as a candidate. It just takes one opponent to start sending kind of undermining mail out to voters, and that'll do you in.
Right.
And that's even before you get to the anti-Mormon mail that went out against Romney in 2008. There were not just physical mail campaigns, but emails saying things like, one told voters, those dark suspicions you have in your head about Mormons, you should listen to them. You should trust your instincts. And
trust your dark side.
I don't think that's going away.
Do those whispering campaigns and email mass mailings, does that sort of thing ever cause a backlash? Or is it a thing that there are never any fingerprints, so there's never any downside for those who do it?
I think it can cause a backlash. This isn't necessarily an example of a whispering campaign because it was a paid television commercial, but in the mid-1990s, I want to say it was 96, Tom Harkin was running for re-election, and at the last 2 weeks of the campaign, his opponent put up a TV ad with a priest who was kind of snarling at the camera and saying what a bad Catholic Tom Harkin was, and how his vote against the partial birth abortion ban made him unfit to be in the Senate. And a lot of folks in Iowa were offended by that, and offended by the use of a priest in a political ad like that. And there was certainly a backlash. So you can overdo it in terms of criticizing somebody's faith. But
I always love it when, for any reason, a negative ad goes too far and voters say, no, I'm not going to take, that's coming back on the person who does the ad. But it too rarely happens. People usually use negative ads because they work. Yeah. A lot of times.
Yeah. Well, I can try a not subtle segue from negative ads to criticism, which John Boehner has been getting in the last couple of weeks, and Paul Ryan as well, from, I think, unexpected corners. Boehner, I guess this was a few weeks ago now, had been invited to give the commencement address and receive an honorary degree at Catholic University here in D.C. And a group of, I think, 70 or 80 theologians and priests and nuns and lay Catholic professors signed a letter essentially saying, John Boehner has a voting record of being very bad on issues that help the poor, and declaring that he was not truly pro-life because his economic policies did not match his positions on things like abortion. It was interesting. I mean, you and I both saw the column that E.J. Dionne had earlier this week about it. What do you think in terms of how that was covered and whether it seemed surprising to anybody?
Well, I don't think it should be surprising that, Catholics do not have a comfortable home in either party. There are many Catholics, myself included, who tend to emphasize issues of justice and economic equality over some of the other issues, even though I also consider myself pro-life. And then there are many, many Catholics, too, who say no, the life issue is so fundamental that it trumps all of other issues. But there is that split, there is that tension, and the truth is that neither party is a completely comfortable fit for those who vote in concert with their Catholic faith, with Catholic teaching.
Right.
So it shouldn't be a surprise then that, especially given the fact that Jesus did preach more than anything else about taking care of those who are less fortunate, about taking care of the poor, that there would be that criticism of Boehner and of Paul Ryan. I did not hear anybody, though, saying that Boehner should not be invited to speak or be honored at Catholic University. When there was all the criticism about my alma mater, Notre Dame, for inviting Barack Obama, when you get a president to come to your university, you don't have to agree with them. It's not an endorsement, but it's a great thing to have your graduates get to hear the President of the United States, and as it's a great thing to have your graduates get to hear from the Speaker of the House. So I think it was wonderful that Catholic University invited Boehner, even if I also understand the criticism of his policies as less than true to Catholic teaching.
Right.
As for the coverage, the point of E.J. Dionne's column was that the media that criticizes incivility in politics really demands it in another way, because we don't give the same coverage to a calm and respectful protest, such as those who weren't thinking that Boehner was the greatest choice of a commencement speaker for Catholic U, when we give so much more ink and airtime to the brouhaha at Notre Dame. And I think there's a little something to that. I think that in general we demand a narrative of conflict. Mm-hmm. Everything has to always be seen through a prism of conflict, even though that's in my mind, not every story has to work like that. But I also think, the Notre Dame story was so much more dramatic. When you have the campus was under siege for weeks. You had planes flying over carrying, with a sign behind it with pictures of fetuses, and you had many, there were altercations, and there were protesters who had come from far away being bussed in, so you didn't have anything like that dramatic a scene at the Catholic University.
But isn't that AJ's point, that we in a way rewarded the protesters who really dialed up the bombast at Notre Dame, and if these progressive Catholics, who I guess they would have had to have personality transplants for this to happen, but if they had, demanded that Boehner be denied communion until, his voting record on the poor changed, or demanded that Catholic, rescind the invitation or rescind the degree. They didn't do any of those things. They just kind of used the letter as a teaching moment to say, Speaker Boehner, we want to remind you about Catholic teaching on these issues, and this is a good chance to get your attention on it.
Yes, but the progressive critics of Boehner were never going to demand that he be denied communion, because that would be totally hypocritical after saying that those who demanded that pro-choice Catholics not be able to receive communion. Our position is that, that's really between the communicant and God. It's not, I don't want to see at the communion rail, of course there hasn't really been a rail in decades, but, I don't want it to be like a cash register where you have the list of people who've written bad checks. And that's really not a visual that the huge majority of Catholics of all, political persuasions are not in favor of that. Yeah. In fact, I always say that John Kerry would have been elected president if any priest had actually denied him communion, because that would have been such an unpopular position. Mm-hmm. But I don't think these progressives who really decried that could go back and say Boehner shouldn't be, or anyone else with his views, shouldn't be receiving communion.
But then by not being hypocritical, they don't get covered.
Right. But some of that, I think we do go too far in demanding, in rewarding, as you say, the more dramatic, episodes of conflict. But at the same time, you have to say, well, it's more of a story. I don't know. My husband and I went to our daughter's chorus concert a couple nights ago, and at the last moment, just as the concert was over, the principal popped out in front of, he almost knocked over one of the girls who was starting to leave the stage, to say, all we ever hear from the media is how bad kids are and all the bad things they do. I wish someone could cover this, could see these from the media, could see these fine young people and cover this fine event tonight. And of course, my husband, being the wiseacre he has, said, I better duck out and tell him to hold page 1. But good stories are not stories in the same way.
It's true, but I ended up covering the Boehner criticism and another story, which we'll get to in a second, because I thought they were good stories, that even though the church has had a very consistent, strong position in favor of programs that help the poor, and even government programs that help the poor, it is hard for me to remember a time when Republican politicians were actually held to account for it. And that's been changing in the last couple of years. It's changing because there's just a different infrastructure now. There's a group called Catholics United, which raises money to do things like run radio ads in the districts of Republican members of the House who vote against children's health care and ask whether they're truly pro-life. That didn't exist before. And all of that, to me, is a story of a new movement and a change within the wider Catholic community that, I think even if it's not planes flying banners of fetuses, it's still a pretty compelling new story.
No, you're right. I'm not surprised that it didn't get as much coverage.
Oh, right.
Yeah.
Well, we definitely can.
One of the most interesting things I saw during the midterms was I went on the bus tour of the Susan B. Anthony list bus tour, taking on the pro-life Democrats who voted for health care reform.
Right.
And, of course, there is a huge disagreement over whether any dime for abortion services was in the healthcare reform package, and back at Politics Daily, my former home, I thought David Gibson did a terrific job of showing that really, no, there was not any such money in it. But it was so interesting that at every stop they were met by these, the Catholic group you just referred to, Catholics United. And so it was such an unusual thing to have. It was a lot of pro-life Catholics versus pro-life Catholics. And it really, talk about the narcissism of small differences. I mean, there was a lot of fury in both groups. It wasn't well attended on either side. But just, I think that a lot of outsiders might be surprised at how strong the debate is between those groups that really essentially agree on a lot.
Yeah, well, I thought the same thing when I looked at the Washington Post homepage this morning, though I guess we're not supposed to date ourselves in these conversations. But anyway, I saw that there was a short opinion piece by Ed Gillespie defending John Boehner as a good Catholic. And I thought that is a huge sign that the conversation has changed. The fact that Republicans have to defend themselves now on their Catholicism is something we just haven't seen. That's always been the position Democrats have been in. And in a way, Republicans lose the beginning that when that conversation changes. But let's talk as well about Paul Ryan, who has come under attack for his budget and Medicare plans. But also, interestingly, there are a couple of things with him in the last couple of weeks. So he was engaged in some correspondence with Archbishop Dolan in New York, who also happens to be now head of the Catholic Bishops' Conference. But also, he has been the subject of attacks from another progressive Christian group, the American Values Network, which has been running a TV ad they put together about Ryan's love of Ayn Rand, which is really something, if you have a chance to take a look at it, because she was just incredibly anti-religion, very anti-Christianity. Ryan says, it was her philosophy that really motivated him to get into politics, and that, he just thinks she was right on so many things, and developed this morality of capitalism, and, encourages all of his staff members to read her books. And I don't think a lot of conservative Christians were aware of the disconnect between their beliefs and the philosophy of this writer who they may have heard of but didn't really know much about.
Right. Well, Rand and Rome really don't go together, that's for sure. And this whole controversy over whether Dolan was or was not putting his imprimatur on Ryan's budget plan, I mean, that's been very interesting to see with, Ryan's people initially sort of showing this Dolan letter around as proof that it was an endorsement, when Dolan, who is a diplomat, really was, I mean, I sort of saw it more as the equivalent of, as a mom, you're saying maybe when your child is not quite measuring up, what you do is say, well, I really like the way you, in other words,
yes.
saying something that seems encouraging, but that doesn't really mean you're right where you need to be yet.
Or an editor telling you that you just need to tweak a few words. We need you to wholesale rewrite your article, but just tweak a few things.
Or the dreaded term, it's all there. Right. That's how I saw what Dolan was saying. And, of course, since then he has clarified that was not an endorsement of Ryan's plan.
Yeah, and I'm not surprised that the Ryan folks trotted out this letter, which again, kind of the interesting thing about the letter was the very careful and, as you say, diplomatic phrasing of everything over and over and over. Dolan talks about in your letter you express knowledge of all these Catholic principles. In your letter, I'm so glad to see that you acknowledge that we have a responsibility to care for the poor. He never says in your budget, and carefully stays away from that. But the letter, on the face of it, the Ryan camp decided to spin to the press as an endorsement of his effort, and could be interpreted as an endorsement of his budget. And Politico at least fell for it, which kind of set the coverage of what it meant, which led a few of us who did a little more careful reading to push back. And now, as you say, Dolan has come out on his blog, and I have to say I love that all these cardinals and archbishops now have blogs, and you can see them in their own words. And for many of them, it's obvious it's not some PR guy who's writing it. But it is, for instance, up in Boston, Cardinal Sean at cardinalseansblog.org, who's writing every week about what's going on. But anyway, Dolan made clear that he did not intend the letter as an endorsement, regardless of what Ryan's office may have said and what certain publications may have interpreted that as. So again, we have a situation where leading Republicans have been criticized because the Catholic Bishops' Conference did send a letter in April to Congress really ripping into the budget and saying not that they explicitly oppose it, but that they are very, very concerned about cuts to programs to help the poor, cuts to education programs, and
food stamps,
international aid, all sorts of stuff. And it was a pretty harsh letter for the Bishop Conference. Again, these are letters that get sent all the time, but nobody really pays attention to them because if it doesn't have to do with abortion,
you're absolutely right about that. I mean, that is true. That the bishops have consistently come down, have lobbied for programs for the poor and for immigrants, and those stands tend to be overlooked by the media, and we do focus so much more on abortion politics.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, and I think it has a negative effect on both parties. I think it leads sometimes some Republicans to assume that Catholics are on their side about everything because they are birds of a feather when it comes to some social issues. And it leads some Democrats to be hesitant about working with Catholics, even though, you say, on immigration, on the environment, on the START Treaty last fall, all sorts of issues. There are areas of common ground and areas where the church, in fact, has been a pretty strong voice. Well,
I think that's because there are a handful of American bishops who have been willing to be very outspoken about saying you cannot vote for a politician who disagrees with the church on abortion and on life issues. And even though that's only a small handful of people, you don't ever hear the contrary. You never hear someone saying, and you never will, you can't vote for someone who doesn't give the proper attention to the poor.
Right. Although, again, that's one reason these groups like Catholics United are popping up, is to try to both broaden the definition of what it means to be pro-life and hold politicians accountable when they don't, or when they pick and choose. We hear the phrase cafeteria Catholic a lot, but it's almost always applied to Democratic Catholics. And I think they're trying to hold Republicans accountable as well. I think our hour is just about up.
Oh my goodness.
I know, it just flies by. Especially when you're doing it for the third time. I'm impressed by how we either have very short memories and so can say the same thing without remembering that we said it before, or managed to put the same enthusiasm into it. But I'm so glad that we had a chance to do this. And
me too, Amy.
Looking at the election season we have stretching out before us, I have a feeling there are going to be a lot of religion and politics issues coming up, and I hope we can do this again.
There always are, and I do too. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you. Bye.
Take care. Have a great weekend.
You too.
See you.
Bye.